Somewhere along the banks of Louisiana's Bayou Teche, there exists a plantation record that was deliberately destroyed in 1859. Court documents from New Orleans reference a murder trial that ended abruptly with all transcripts sealed by judicial order. Local parish registries show 71 separate burial plots on a single property, all dated within the same week, yet official death certificates list only natural causes. For over a century and a half, one name has been whispered in the darkness of Louisiana's sugarcane fields, a name that represents both unspeakable cruelty and shocking vengeance. Tonight, we're uncovering what truly occurred on the DeVaux plantation and why the truth was buried deeper than any grave. Before we continue with the story of Patience DeVaux and the girl who shattered everything he built, I want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to hear what comes next? Let's find out together. The truth begins not with violence, but with a bill of sale. St. Landry Parish stretched across the fertile Louisiana lowlands like a patchwork quilt of wealth and suffering. By 1853, the region had become one of the most profitable sugar-producing areas in the entire South, with plantations lining the bayou, generating fortunes that rivaled those of European nobility. The town of Opelousas served as the parish seat, a bustling community of approximately 3,000 souls, planters, merchants, overseers, and the enslaved people who made their prosperity possible. Among the plantation owners, Patience DeVaux stood out not for his wealth, which was considerable, but for his peculiar reputation. A third-generation planter whose family had arrived from France in the 1760s, Patience, named for a Puritan ancestor on his mother's side, had inherited the Belle Ombre plantation at 28 following his father's death from yellow fever. Now 42 years old, he ran his 300-acre sugar operation with what neighbors diplomatically called exacting standards. The DeVaux plantation house rose 3 stories above the Louisiana mud, its white columns gleaming in the subtropical sun. 73 enslaved people worked the property. In the fields, the sugar mill, the house, and the various outbuildings that made up the complex machinery of plantation life. The property was profitable, producing nearly 200 hogsheads of sugar annually, enough to maintain DeVaux's position among the parish's elite planters. But Belle Ombre harbored a secret that even the most callous of DeVaux's fellow planters would have found disturbing. DeVaux himself cut an imposing figure, all and lean, with angular features that suggested aristocratic breeding. He dressed impeccably, favoring dark suits even in Louisiana's oppressive heat, and maintained a neat beard in the French style. He was educated, having spent 2 years studying in New Orleans, and could quote extensively from both the Bible and classical texts. He attended church every Sunday at St. Landry Catholic Church, sitting in the DeVaux family pew his grandfather had purchased in 1791. His wife, Claudette, had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, along with their infant son. Since then, DeVaux had lived alone in the big house, attended by a rotating staff of house servants who, neighbors noticed, rarely lasted more than a few months before being transferred to fieldwork or sold away entirely. The spring of 1853 brought changes to Belle Ombre. In March, a slave trader named Rufus Gaines arrived from Mobile with a coffle of 22 enslaved people recently imported through the illegal but thriving interstate trade. Among them was a girl of approximately 14 years, though her exact age would never be firmly established. The trader's manifest listed her simply as Negro girl, field hand, healthy stock. She had been born somewhere in Virginia, separated from her mother at age 7 when the estate she belonged to was liquidated to pay debts. Since then, she had passed through 5 different owners, moving steadily southward through the domestic slave trade, each sale taking her further from anything she had known. By the time she reached Louisiana, She had learned to keep her eyes down, her voice silent, and her thoughts hidden behind a mask of compliance. DeVaux purchased her for $800, a significant sum that raised eyebrows among the other planters present at the sale. Field hands typically sold for $500 to $600, but DeVaux had specific requirements, and this girl met them precisely: young, strong enough for work, but small, framed and isolated, with no family connections on any nearby plantation. The bill of sale listed her as Clara, though she would later claim this was not her true name, merely the latest in a series of names given to her by successive owners, each one stripping away more of who she had been. What happened next would transform her into something else entirely. Clara's first month at Belle Ombre passed in the rhythm common to plantation life. She was assigned to the big house, initially working in the kitchen under the supervision of Aunt Rachel, an older woman who had served the DeVaux family for 30 years. The work was demanding, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, maintaining fires, cleaning, washing, and 100 other tasks that kept the household running. But Clara quickly sensed something wrong in the atmosphere of Belle Ombre. The other house servants moved with a particular tension, their eyes darting toward DeVaux whenever he entered a room. Conversation stopped abruptly when he approached, and there were absences, servants who disappeared from the house staff without explanation, replaced by new faces who carried the same haunted expression within weeks. Aunt Rachel tried to warn her in the careful, coded language that enslaved people used to communicate dangerous truths. Master DeVaux, he got particular ways, she said one evening as they scrubbed pots in the kitchen house. You mind yourself, child, keep your head down, do your work, don't never give him cause to notice you special. But it was already too late. On a humid night in late April, DeVaux summoned Clara to his study. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather, lit by oil lamps that cast wavering shadows across walls lined with books. DeVaux sat behind a massive desk of imported mahogany, his face impassive as he regarded her. You can read, can't you? He asked. The question was dangerous. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Louisiana, punishable by whipping or worse. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the floor. No, sir, don't lie to me. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. I saw you looking at the newspaper I left in the dining room. Your eyes were moving across the words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with threat. I asked you a question. DeVaux continued. Can you read? Clara's mind raced through possible responses, calculating which lie might save her. But something in DeVaux's tone suggested he already knew the answer, that this was some kind of test with no safe outcome. Some, sir, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. My first master's daughter. She taught me some before I was sold away. Before you were sold away. DeVaux finished the sentence for her. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Interesting, very interesting indeed. What Clara didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Patience DeVaux had been searching for exactly this combination of attributes. He needed someone literate, someone isolated, someone who could be molded to his purposes, someone who wouldn't be missed. Over the following weeks, Clara's duties shifted. She was assigned to clean DeVaux's private rooms, to organize his papers, to assist him with correspondence. The work itself seemed almost easier than her previous tasks, but it came with a price that became clear incrementally through small degradations that built upon each other like layers of sediment. DeVaux began requiring her presence in his study every evening, ostensibly to help with paperwork. But the tasks grew stranger. He would dictate passages from the Bible, making her copy them repeatedly, checking her penmanship with critical eyes. He would quiz her on scripture, punishing wrong answers with hours of standing motionless in corners, denial of meals, or small physical punishments that left no visible marks. A twisted finger bent back until she gasped, pressure applied to the soft spaces behind her ears, his grip on her arm just tight enough to bruise bone, deep without breaking skin. You need to be corrected, he would say in that same calm, conversational tone. These are lessons in obedience and submission to proper authority. Do you understand? The other house servants watched with knowing eyes and said nothing. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. By June, Clara's situation had deteriorated beyond anything her previous experience had prepared her for. DeVox's lessons had evolved into systematic torture, carefully calculated to maximize suffering while leaving minimal visible evidence. He was methodical, almost scientific in his approach, as though conducting some dark experiment in human endurance. He kept detailed journals, Clara discovered, documenting his training methods in neat handwriting. She saw them once, left open on his desk, pages filled with observations about pain thresholds, effective punishment techniques, methods of breaking the human will while maintaining physical capacity for work. She realized with horror that she was not the first. The journals referenced other subjects, numbered but not named, with clinical notes about their responses to various treatments. Subject 7 had lasted 3 months before being transferred. Subject 9 showed promising initial compliance but ultimately proved unsuitable. Subject 12, the most recent entry before Clara's arrival, had required disposal after an incident that DeVox described only as regrettable but necessary. Clara was Subject 13. The summer of 1853 settled over St. Landry Parish like a suffocating blanket. In the sugar fields, enslaved workers moved between the cane rows, their bodies dark against the green stalks, their songs carrying across the morning mist. Life at Belle Ombre continued its surface rhythm, the bells marking work hours, the routine of planting and cultivation, the weekly visits from neighboring planters who saw only what DeVox chose to show them. But inside the big house, Clara was disappearing. Not physically. DeVox was too clever for that. She still appeared at meals, still performed her visible duties, still attended to the tasks that would be noticed by others. But piece by piece, something essential was being carved away from her, removed with the precision of a surgeon's knife. DeVox's methods were sophisticated. He understood that breaking a person required more than physical pain. It required isolation, disorientation, the systematic destruction of identity and hope. He rotated his punishments to prevent adaptation, mixed rewards with cruelty to create confusion, used sleep deprivation and forced wakefulness to blur the boundaries of reality. Some nights he would summon her to read aloud from his favorite texts, passages from the Old Testament about masters and servants, obedience and punishment, the divine order of hierarchy. Other nights he would force her to stand motionless for hours while he worked at his desk, punishing any movement with fresh torments. He deprived her of food, then presented elaborate meals and watched her eat while asking questions designed to humiliate. He gave her tasks impossible to complete, then punished the inevitable failures with methodical cruelty. Through it all, he maintained his facade of respectability. On Sundays, he attended church services, standing to sing hymns with his rich baritone voice. He hosted dinner parties where he entertained neighboring planters with discussions of sugar prices and political developments. He was known as a cultured man, perhaps a bit reserved since his wife's death, but hardly worthy of suspicion. The other enslaved people at Belle Ombre knew, of course. They always knew, but what could they do? Speaking out meant death, or worse, being sold away to the brutal sugar plantations further south, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. So they averted their eyes and whispered prayers and tried not to think about the sounds that sometimes echoed from the big house late at night. Aunt Rachel tried once to intervene. She approached the overseer, a man named Dalton who managed the field operations, and carefully suggested that Clara was being worked too hard, that perhaps she should be reassigned to other duties. Dalton listened with an impassive expression, then reported the conversation directly to DeVox. Rachel spent 3 days in the punishment shed, a small building behind the sugar mill where infractions were corrected, emerging with fresh scars on her back and a new understanding of the boundaries of what could be risked. She never spoke of Clara again, though sometimes Clara would find small things left for her, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a cup of water placed where she would find it, small gestures of solidarity that carried enormous risk. As summer turned toward fall, Clara began to change in ways that went beyond the physical. Something was hardening inside her, crystallizing through the heat of her suffering into a form that even she didn't fully recognize. The mask of compliance remained, but behind it, something else was growing, not hope, which DeVaux had systematically destroyed, but something colder and more durable, calculation. She began to study DeVaux the way he studied her, learning his patterns and habits, his strengths and vulnerabilities. She observed which days he drank heavily from the crystal decanter in his study, how the alcohol made him careless. She noticed that he kept the key to his private rooms on a chain around his neck, but that he removed it before sleeping. She learned the layout of the house with the detailed precision of someone planning an escape, counting steps in the darkness, memorizing the locations of loose floorboards and squeaking hinges. She also began to understand the full scope of what DeVaux had been doing. Through careful observation and pieced together fragments of overheard conversation, she realized that she was far from his first victim. Over the past decade, at least a dozen enslaved people, always young, always isolated, always purchased from distant sellers, had passed through his hands and disappeared. Some had been sold away, their spirits broken. Others had died, their deaths attributed to disease or accident. One, the girl who had preceded Clara by only 4 months, had been found drowned in the bayou. Her death ruled a suicide despite the suspicious circumstances. The truth Clara was discovering would have shocked even the hardened planters of St. Landry Parish. If you're finding this story as disturbing as it is compelling, hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in Clara's position? Let's find out together what happened next. What Clara didn't yet know was that DeVaux had begun planning her disposal. In his journal, he had started making notes about her deteriorating usefulness and increasing risk of detection. He had already contacted the trader Rufus Gaines about potential buyers in the Deep South, places where questions wouldn't be asked and records wouldn't be kept. Clara had perhaps 2 weeks before she would be sold away, or worse. October arrived with its deceptive coolness, the brutal heat of summer giving way to temperatures that made fieldwork almost bearable. The sugarcane stood tall and ready for harvest, and Belle Ombre prepared for the grinding season, the most intense and profitable period of the plantation year, when the cane would be cut and processed into raw sugar in a round, the clock operation that would consume everyone's energy for weeks. DeVaux's mood had shifted in ways that Clara recognized as dangerous. He had become almost jovial, sometimes humming to himself as he worked at his desk. He had also become less meticulous in his torments, as though his attention had moved beyond her to some future prospect. She understood why when she overheard a conversation between DeVaux and his overseer in early October. "Gaines will be here on the 20th, DeVaux was saying. "I need you to prepare the girl, have her cleaned up, make her presentable. He's found a buyer in the sugar parishes south of New Orleans. They're not particular about condition, but they do want the merchandise delivered intact." The overseer's response was too quiet to hear, but DeVaux's reply came clearly. "Don't concern yourself with the details. Just make sure she's ready for transport. After that, she becomes someone else's problem." Clara's heart pounded as she absorbed this information. October 20th was 12 days away. 12 days until she would be sold into what everyone knew were the most brutal conditions in the entire South. The vast sugar plantations where enslaved people were worked to death and replaced like war. Now tools, where life expectancy was 3 to 5 years, where survival itself was considered a form of extraordinary luck. She would not live long enough to be sold. The decision formed in her mind not as a conscious choice, but as an inevitability, like water finding its path downhill. She could not escape. The patrol system was too efficient, the geography too hostile to runaways, especially a young woman traveling alone. She could not appeal to authorities. The law itself considered her property, not a person with rights to protection. She could not hope for rescue or intervention. Everyone who knew of her situation had already demonstrated their powerlessness or unwillingness to act, but she could act herself. That night, Clara took inventory of her resources. They were pitifully few. Her knowledge of the house, her literacy, her familiarity with Devox's routines, and her access to his private rooms. She also had something else, something that Devox himself had given her without realizing it. A detailed understanding of anatomy and infliction of pain, learned from observing his methods, from enduring them, from reading the clinical descriptions in his journals. She began to plan with the same methodical care that Devox had applied to her destruction. The tools she needed were readily available in any plantation household. The sugar mill had sharp implements for cutting cane. The kitchen held knives of various sizes. The carpentry shop contained saws and axes. But Clara understood that her window of opportunity would be measured in minutes, perhaps seconds. She needed something immediately accessible, something that wouldn't raise suspicion if she carried it, something that could serve her purposes efficiently. She found it in Devox's own study. Among the various items on his desk was a letter opener, a foot-long blade of Sheffield steel, sharp enough to slice paper with precision, pointed enough to penetrate leather, substantial enough to serve as a weapon if wielded with sufficient force. Devox used it daily, leaving it lying on his desk among his papers, a tool so ordinary that its potential lethality was invisible. Clara also made another discovery during her careful surveillance of Devox's evening routine. On Wednesday nights, he indulged in particularly heavy drinking, consuming most of a bottle of bourbon while reviewing the week's plantation accounts. The alcohol made him drowsy, made him careless, made him vulnerable in ways he would never be when sober. Wednesday, October 14, 6 days before she was scheduled to be sold away, would be her only chance. The days leading up to October 14th passed with excruciating slowness. Clara moved through her routine with mechanical precision, her mind operating on two levels simultaneously, performing her duties while constantly reviewing her plan, searching for flaws, calculating probabilities, preparing for contingencies. She was terrified. The fear lived in her stomach like a physical thing, making food difficult to swallow, making sleep impossible. But underneath the fear was something else, something that burned with a cold, steady flame. Not hatred, exactly. Hatred was too hot, too consuming. This was something colder and more durable, a commitment to action regardless of consequence, an acceptance of whatever price would need to be paid. The plantation continued its rhythms around her, oblivious to the storm gathering in one girl's heart. In the fields, the cane stood ready for harvest, its tall stalks rustling in the October breeze. In the sugar mill, the overseer Dalton supervised repairs to the grinding equipment, preparing for the intense weeks ahead when the mill would run day and night. In the quarters, enslaved families gathered after dark, sharing meals and stories, creating moments of humanity in a system designed to deny it. Clara observed all of this with a strange detachment, as though she were already a ghost, already separated from the world of the living. She found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to before. The way morning light caught in spider webs strung between the porch columns, the particular sound of Aunt Rachel's humming as she worked in the kitchen, the smell of wood smoke drifting across the yard in the evening. These things seemed suddenly precious, suddenly worthy of attention, as though her mind was cataloging them for a future that might not include such observations. On Monday, October 12th, a traveling preacher arrived at Belle Ombre. This was common practice in rural Louisiana, sir. Trading ministers who moved from plantation to plantation, conducting services for enslaved communities who were permitted to gather for worship under supervised conditions. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Caldwell, set up in the cleared space behind the quarters, and DeVaux graciously permitted his enslaved workers to attend the evening service. Clara went because absence would be noticed, would raise questions. She sat at the back of the gathered crowd, perhaps 80 people assembled in the fading light, and listened as Reverend Caldwell preached about deliverance. His text was from Exodus, the story of Moses leading the Hebrew people out of bondage in Egypt, the plagues that fell upon their oppressors, the parting of the Red Sea. "The Lord sees your suffering," Caldwell proclaimed, his voice carrying across the crowd. "He hears your cries, and in His time, in His way, He will deliver you from bondage. You must have faith. You must believe that justice, though delayed, will surely come." The words washed over Clara like water over stone. She had heard such promises before, had clung to them during her darkest moments, had prayed for deliverance until her voice was raw and her knees were bruised from kneeling, but deliverance had not come. Justice had not arrived. God, if He existed, seemed remarkably uninterested in the sufferings of enslaved people in Louisiana. She would not wait for divine intervention. She would create her own deliverance, deliver her own justice, even if the price was her life. After the service, as people dispersed back to their cabins, Aunt Rachel approached Clara with unusual directness. The older woman's face was deeply lined, her hands gnarled from decades of labor, but her eyes were sharp and knowing. "Child," she said quietly, positioning herself so that their conversation would appear casual to any observer, "whatever you're planning, don't do it." Clara felt her heart skip. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. "I seen that look before. I seen it on the face of a boy named Samuel maybe 10 years back. He had that same expression you wearing now, like someone who's decided dying is better than living. You know what happened to Samuel?" Clara shook her head. "They caught him before he could do whatever he was planning, beat him so bad he couldn't walk for a month. Then they sold him to a trader heading for the cotton fields in Mississippi. I heard he died within a year, worked to death in the hot sun." Rachel paused, letting the lesson sink in. "Whatever Master DeVaux done to you, child, it ain't worth throwing your life away." "My life is already thrown away," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm being sold on the 20th to the sugar parishes south of New Orleans. You know what that means." Rachel's expression shifted, genuine distress crossing her weathered features. "Oh, child, no, not there. So tell me, Aunt Rachel, what's the difference between dying quickly and dying slowly? At least one way I get to choose. At least one way I get to take something with me when I go." The older woman was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching Clara's face. Then slowly she nodded. "I can't stop you, I know that, but I can tell you this. If you're going to do what I think you're going to do, you make sure you finish it. Don't leave him alive to tell what happened. Don't give him chance to hurt nobody else. You understand? I understand." Rachel reached out and squeezed Clara's hand, a gesture so brief that anyone watching would have missed it. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul, child, and may He have none on his." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness between the cabins, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and her terrible resolution. Tuesday, October 13th, dawned gray and cool with low clouds promising rain that never came. Clara woke before dawn as always and moved through her morning routine with the automatic precision of long practice. She built up the kitchen fires, helped prepare breakfast, carried trays to the big house, cleaned rooms, washed dishes, performed the endless small tasks that made up the machinery of domestic service. But today was different. Today, every action carried extra weight, every moment potentially her last experience of ordinary things. She found herself paying attention to sensations she normally ignored. The texture of linen under her fingers as she folded laundry, the warmth of sun breaking through clouds to touch her face, the taste of the small piece of cornbread she ate for lunch. In the afternoon, Devox summoned her to his study for what she recognized with grim clarity would be his final session of torment before she was sold away. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, walked down the hallway past the portraits of Devox's ancestors staring down with painted eyes, and knocked on the study door. "Enter," his voice called. The room was exactly as it always was, orderly, scholarly, deceptively civilized. Books lined the walls, their leather spines gleaming in the afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Devox's desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers, ledgers, correspondence. The crystal decanter of bourbon sat in its usual place along with 2 glasses. Oil lamps waited to be lit when evening came. Devox sat behind his desk, dressed impeccably as always in a dark suit and crisp white shirt. He looked up as Clara entered, his expression mild, almost pleasant. "Ah, Clara, come in, close the door, sit down." He gestured to the straight, back chair positioned before his desk, the chair where Clara had spent so many hours enduring his particular brand of education. She sat, keeping her eyes downcast in the posture of submission. He demanded, "I want to talk to you about your future." Devox began, steepling his fingers in a gesture she had come to know well. "Mr. Gaines will be arriving in a few days to complete your transfer to new ownership. I thought you might have questions about what to expect." This was new. Devox had never before shown interest in explaining or justifying his decisions. The novelty of it was almost surreal. "I have no questions, sir," Clara said quietly. "No, you're not curious about where you're going, what kind of work you'll be doing." Devox's tone was conversational, almost friendly. This, Clara understood, was part of his psychological method, the unpredictable shifts between cruelty and kindness, keeping his subjects off balance, never certain what to expect. "No, sir." He studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp despite the mild expression. "You're lying. You know exactly where you're going. The sugar parishes, the places where they grind up workers like cane stalks, where 5 years is considered a long life. You're terrified, aren't you?" Clara said nothing. "It's all right to admit fear," Devox continued. "Fear is rational, fear is appropriate. What you should fear most, however, is not the future, but the possibility of trying to avoid it. Do you understand what I'm saying, Clara?" He was warning her not to try to escape, not to try to resist, not to try anything that would make him escalate his response. The warning itself was almost gentle, which made it more terrifying than any explicit threat. "I understand, sir. Good." Devox leaned back in his chair, seemingly satisfied. "You've been a challenging subject, Clara, not as compliant as some, but more resilient than most. I'll miss our evenings together in a way, but all experiments must eventually conclude, and I find myself eager to begin fresh work with new material." He paused, pouring himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter, sipping it slowly. "Do you hate me, Clara?" The question was a trap. Either answer would displease him, would earn fresh punishment. But Clara found herself responding with unexpected honesty. "No, sir." And it was true. She didn't hate him. Hatred implied a relationship, an emotional connection, a recognition of shared humanity. What she felt toward Patience Devox was something far colder, an absolute determination that he should cease to exist, delivered with the emotional investment of someone deciding to exterminate vermin. Devox seemed pleased by her answer, missing entirely the truth behind it. "Good," he said. "Hatred clouds judgment. Submission requires clarity of mind and purity of obedience. You're learning even at this late stage." He paused again, swirling the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "I've kept detailed records of our time together. Did you know that? Observations, measurements, assessments of technique and result. Quite fascinating, really. The human capacity for adaptation, for endurance, for survival even under the most adverse conditions. You've contributed to a body of knowledge that might someday prove valuable." Clara listened to this with a strange detachment. He was describing her suffering as research, her pain as data, her existence as nothing more than experimental material. It should have provoked some response: rage, disgust, despair, but she felt nothing except the cold certainty of what would happen tomorrow night. "You may go," DeVox said finally, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Get some rest. Mr. Dalton will want you looking presentable when Mr. Gaines arrives." Clara stood, curtsied in the manner he required, and left the study. She walked down the hallway, down the stairs, through the house to the kitchen, moving like a mechanism wound tight, and counting down to release. Aunt Rachel was alone in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. She looked up as Clara entered, her eyes asking questions that couldn't be spoken aloud. Clara nodded once, a tiny movement that conveyed everything. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. Then she returned to her work, her knife moving through carrots with steady precision, and Clara understood that no more would be said between them. Some things went beyond words, beyond advice, beyond anything except silent witness. That evening, Clara lay on her pallet in the small room off the kitchen where she slept, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Around her, the house settled into its nighttime rhythms, the distant sounds of the overseer making his rounds, the murmur of voices from the quarters beyond the yard, the creak of wood and whisper of wind. She should sleep. She would need all her strength for what was coming, but sleep was impossible, her mind too active, too full of scenarios and possibilities and calculations. She thought about her mother, whom she barely remembered, a soft voice singing in the darkness, warm arms holding her, a face that had faded to nothing more than impression and longing. She thought about the 7-year-old girl she had been, standing on an auction block in Virginia, trying not to cry as strange white men examined her teeth and felt her arms and discussed her value in voices that treated her as an object, not a person. She thought about all the owners who had followed, each one stripping away another layer of who she had been until she could no longer remember her real name, the name her mother had given her, the name that had connected her to family and history and identity. Who was she now? Not Clara. That was just another name imposed by ownership. Not even fully human anymore, at least not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of the society that permitted and profited from her bondage. But tomorrow night she would become something, someone, a person who had acted, who had chosen, who had refused to be passive in the face of her own destruction. It wasn't much. It probably wasn't enough. But it was what she had. The hours until dawn passed with excruciating slowness. Clara must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of the plantation bell ringing the call to morning labor, gray light filtering through the single window of her room. Wednesday, October 14th, her last day as Clara, her last day as anything. She rose, dressed in her work clothes, and began her final day at Belle Ombre. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Clara moved through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her body performing familiar actions while her mind remained elsewhere, counting down hours and then minutes to the moment that would change everything. Breakfast preparation, cleaning the dining room, carrying water, sweeping floors, washing dishes, the endless cycle of domestic labor that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember. At midday, she ate a small meal of cornbread and beans, forcing herself to swallow despite the knot of tension in her stomach. She would need energy. She would need strength. She could not afford weakness. In the afternoon, she found herself alone in DeVox's study during her routine cleaning. The room was empty, DeVox having gone to inspect the sugar mill with his overseer. This was her opportunity. The letter opener lay on his desk among various papers and correspondence, its Sheffield steel blade catching the afternoon light. Clara had cleaned around it 100 times, had polished its brass handle, had never considered it as anything except another piece of the room's furnishings. Now she saw it differently. She saw its length, A full foot from tip to handle, she saw its weight substantial enough to penetrate leather or heavy cloth. She saw its edge, sharp enough to slice through paper with precision, sharp enough to cut flesh if wielded with force. She picked it up, testing its balance, feeling how it fit in her hand. It was heavier than she expected, more substantial, more real. This was not an abstraction anymore. This was a weapon. This was the tool that would transform intent into action. Her heart hammered in her chest as she made her decision. She couldn't wait until evening to secure it. If DeVaux noticed its absence before then, everything would be ruined. But carrying it on her person all afternoon was risky. If she was searched for any reason, if it was discovered. She made her choice. Carefully, she wrapped the letter opener in a cleaning cloth, then tucked it into the deep pocket of her work dress, arranging the fabric so that the shape wouldn't be obvious to casual observation. The weight of it pulled at her pocket, a constant reminder of what was coming, of what she was about to become. She finished her cleaning, left the study, and moved through the rest of the afternoon with the letter opener pressed against her thigh through layers of cloth, its presence a secret weight that only she knew about. Evening came. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost obscenely beautiful. Clara helped prepare dinner, served DeVaux his meal in the dining room, cleared the dishes afterward, moved through her routine while the knife in her pocket waited, patient and cold. At 8 o'clock, DeVaux retired to his study as was his Wednesday custom. Through the closed door, Clara could hear familiar sounds. The clink of glass on glass as he poured bourbon, the creak of his chair, the rustle of papers as he worked through plantation accounts and correspondence. She waited in the hallway outside, her back against the wall, one hand in her pocket wrapped around the letter opener's handle. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain everyone in the house must hear it, certain that someone would discover her lurking here and demand to know what she was doing, but no one came. The house was quiet except for distant sounds from the kitchen and quarters, the ordinary noises of evening at Belle Ombre. Time passed with strange elasticity, seconds stretching into minutes, minutes compressing into moments. Clara found herself in an odd state of consciousness, simultaneously hyper, aware of every sensation and somehow distant from them all, as though she were watching herself from outside her own body. At 9 o'clock, precisely on schedule, DeVaux's voice called through the door. "Clara, attend me." This was the moment. This was the threshold. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back, no undoing, no reprieve. Everything that followed would flow inevitably from what happened in the next hours. Clara took a breath, feeling the letter opener's weight in her pocket one last time. Then she opened the study door and stepped inside. The study was warm, lit by 2 oil lamps that cast wavering shadows across the walls of books. DeVaux sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face slightly flushed from the bourbon he'd been drinking. The bottle beside him was more than half empty. He had consumed more than usual tonight, which was exactly what Clara had been counting on. His movements when he gestured for her to close the door were slightly less precise than normal, his eyes slightly unfocused. He was drunk, or close to it, vulnerable in ways he would never be when sober, his guard lowered, his reaction slowed, his judgment impaired. "Come here," he ordered, gesturing to the spot beside his desk where Clara had stood so many times before. Clara moved forward, her right hand still in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the letter opener's handle. Everything seemed to slow down, each second stretching into eternity. She could see individual dust motes floating in the lamplight. She could hear her own breathing, her own heartbeat, the creak of floorboards beneath her feet. She could smell the bourbon on DeVaux's breath, the tobacco smoke that clung to his clothes, the faint scent of leather and old paper that permeated the study. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. In her peripheral vision, she could see the crystal decanter on DeVaux's desk, the light refracting through the amber liquid within it. She could see the ledger books stacked neatly on the corner of his desk. each one recording the financial transactions that reduced human beings to columns of numbers and profit margins. She could see DeVaux's hands, the hands that had inflicted so much calculated suffering, resting on the desk's surface, fingers drumming idly against the polished wood.